Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So in the previous video we started the topic, the process of decolonization, when we discussed nationalism. So we discussed the definition of nationalism and also discussed the concept of proto-nationalism. Now we are moving on to nationalism after World War II, the agitation for independence. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to my school channel. Like I said earlier, we're moving on to part 2 of this video lesson on the process of decolonization, that is nationalism. So we're discussing nationalism after World War II, the agitation for independence. So let's dive right into it. Alright, so the period following the Second World War, that is 1939 to 1945, ushered in a new wave of political consciousness and mass agitation for immediate self-rule. So nationalist movements, which had previously relied on petitions and delegations, became more assertive and mass-oriented. So we talked about how under the era of proto-nationalism, the nationalists then, they preferred the process of petition and delegation to the colonial authorities. But these nationalists that came after the Second World War, they were more assertive in their approach. They were agitating for independence. So that's the difference between these two different eras of nationalism. So what are the key characteristics of this era? One is that there was militant nationalism. So the end of World War II witnessed a decline of elite-led approaches and the rise of militant, mass-based movements. So organizations such as the Zikist movement in Nigeria adopted radical strategies, including civil disobedience and anti-colonial propaganda. So you can see how this is different from the proto-nationalist era. They were actually coming out to agitate for independence. They were using different radical means, such as civil disobedience and propaganda, to ensure that the independence is granted to them at the end of the day. Now let's move on to another key characteristic. So we have mass participation. Nationalist activities were no longer confined to the educated elites. Students, workers, farmers, ex-servicemen, market women, and the unemployed began to play active roles in protest strikes and rallies. So, unlike the proto-nationalist era, where it was only the educated elites that were advocating for reform within that system, in this post-World War II era, there was mass participation. People from different realms of society came together to advocate for independence. This is because they felt a lot of the racial discrimination that was affecting their daily work. And so they needed to protest in order to safeguard their rights as members of the African society. Students came out, workers, and so many other different people from different realms of society. They all came out to advocate for independence. Now let's move on to another key characteristic. Okay, we also have the spread of political parties. New political parties such as the Convention People's Party in the Gold Coast, that is modern-day Ghana, founded in 1949 by Kwame Nkrumah, and the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, also became powerful platforms for agitation. So remember how we talked about how new political parties were formed during the proto-nationalist era. We had the NNDP, we had the UGCC from the Gold Coast, and so on and so forth. These were political parties that advocated for political reforms. But the new political parties that developed after the Second World War were advocating for independence. These were new political parties that came afterwards. So we have the CPP and the NCNC of Nigeria. They all came to agitate for independence. These were political parties that were actively agitating for independence. Let's move on to another characteristic. All right, so we also have opposition to colonial structures. Africans increasingly rejected colonial constitutions that limited African political participation. Nationalists began demanding universal adult suffrage, constitutional reforms, and self-government now rather than in the distant future. So there was an active opposition of the colonial structures in the society. They were advocating for reforms of the constitution. That's the reason why the old Clifford Constitution was relegated to the background, and then a new one, the Richards Constitution of 1946, was created. Even at that, there were still so many protests against that new constitution, and so there was constant constitutional reforms during this period. So eventually they started advocating for self-rule, for self-government in Nigeria and other British West African societies. Now let's move on to another key characteristic. Okay, we also have Pan-African and global influence. So leaders were inspired by Pan-Africanism, anti-racism, and global movements for freedom and equality. So the success of the Indian independence movement also served as a powerful inspiration. So in the previous video lesson, we talked about the emergence of the Pan-African movements in America and several other societies where there were blacks, people that originally came from Africa. They were living in diaspora. They all came together to create this Pan-African movement to advocate for the interests of the blacks, the Africans. So this Pan-African movement also influenced the nationalist leaders at this time. After the Second World War, we have people like Nnamdi Azikiwe, Kwame Nkrumah, and so on. They were all inspired by the thoughts, the ideologies of the Pan-African movement. So the Indian independence movement also inspired the anti-colonialist struggle after the Second World War. You see that India gained independence in 1947, and when they saw that one British colonial society was able to gain independence from British authority, other British colonial societies too started advocating for their own independence. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, what are the effects of World War II on nationalism in British West Africa? So the World War II had a grave impact on nationalism. So many things that happened during that period influenced the nationalist agitation that was going on after the war. So one of such effects is the exposure of colonial hypocrisy. So the Allies fought the war under the banner of freedom, democracy, and anti-fascism. Yet African colonies were denying democratic freedoms at home. So this contradiction exposed the hypocrisy of colonial rule and encouraged Africans to demand the same freedoms promised during the war. So during the Second World War, we understand that the Allied forces, that is the United States of America, Britain, and so many other countries, were fighting against the fascist leaders in Germany. This was the reason for the Second World War. And so these Allied forces, they were fighting under the banner of freedom, democracy, and anti-fascism. All of these things were not granted to the African people. They were not granted freedom, they were not granted democracy in the African society, and yet they were fighting for that in other territories in the world. So this gave the African nationalist leaders incentive to fight for freedom and democracy. They tried to expose the colonial hypocrisy at the time. There is also the involvement of African soldiers. So thousands of African soldiers were recruited to fight in various war theaters. We have Burma, North Africa, and Europe. So these ex-servicemen, after fighting alongside Europeans, returned politically awakened. Many joined nationalist movements or led anti-colonial protests, demanding jobs and their rights. So when these African leaders went out to fight on behalf of the British people, they discovered that these British authorities were not as superior as they claimed to be. The hypocrisy that we talked about in point number 1, they witnessed all of these things firsthand. And when they came back, they were promised jobs when they came back to the African society, but they were not granted these jobs. They still experienced the racial discrimination they were experiencing before the war. So all of this led them to begin to advocate for nationalism, for independence within the African society. And that effect is economic hardship and discontent. So wartime policies led to increased taxation, inflation, food shortages, and poor working conditions in the colonies. So cost of living soared and many Africans faced severe hardship. So this economic strain fueled local labor unrest, including strikes by workers in Nigeria. So an example is the 1945 general strike. So they were using most of the revenue generated from the African society to fund the war. And as a result of that, there was a lot of inflation within society. They taxed the Africans heavily in order to get more resources to fund the war, their war efforts outside of the country. So all of these things led to inflation, led to food shortages within the African society. And as a result, so many of the workers within the African society began to protest against colonial authorities. So another effect is trade and labor movements. So following the inflation, food shortages, and low wages as a result of the war, trade unions began to organize large-scale strikes and form alliances with nationalist movements. They brought nationalism to the streets and workplaces. So before all of this inflation and food shortages, the nationalist movement did not have the mass support that they needed. But when these members of these different sectors of the economy. They saw how they were being affected by the decisions made by the colonial authorities. They began to rally behind these nationalist leaders. They began to form trade and labor unions that helped to fight for the rights of the common people, of the common workers against colonial policies. And so this also gave a push to the nationalist movements in British West Africa. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, another effect of the Second World War on nationalism in British West Africa is the weakening of European powers. So the war economically and militarily weakened colonial powers like Britain and France. After the war, Britain could no longer afford to maintain its vast empire indefinitely. So this created opportunities for colonies to push more forcefully for self-rule. So they discovered how the European powers were becoming weakened after the war. They no longer had the resources that they used to have. They no longer had the power that they used to have in the world stage. And as a result of that, the Africans began to push for independence. Then there was also the increase in extraction of raw materials. The war stimulated increased production of raw materials in West Africa to support European war industries. So despite increased exports, Africans received low wages. Profits were sent to Britain and not reinvested locally. So this sparked anti-colonialist sentiments in British West Africa. So the extraction of raw materials began to increase in the African society, but the Africans were not reaping the benefits of that. And as a result of that, they felt like they needed to demand for their rights. These resources were theirs, and so they needed to get some of the benefits that were gotten from the extraction of these raw materials. Then another effect is the rise of superpowers like the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So after World War II, Britain and France were weakened, while USA and USSR emerged as global superpowers with anti-colonial sentiments. So both superpowers encouraged colonial powers to grant more freedoms to avoid rebellion, and this helped to bring African struggle into the international discourse. So after the Second World War, Britain and France, they no longer had that power that they used to have over the world, and the United States of America and the Soviet Union were becoming global superpowers. These countries, they began to advocate for anti-colonialism. They felt like these former colonial authorities should grant independence to their colonial subjects in order to avoid a rebellion. And so the ideology thoughts that were being pushed forward by the United States of America and Russia, they were taken on by the nationalist leaders here in Africa in order to advocate for independence within the African society. There is also the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations, formed in 1945, promoted self-determination and human rights. African nationalists appealed to the United Nations and cited its charter to legitimize demands for independence. So the global attention helped amplify African voices on the world stage. So the United Nations advocates for self-determination and the promotion of fundamental human rights. Some of these fundamental human rights means rights of liberty, freedom to make decisions, to select leaders of your choice. But all of these things were not granted under colonial authority. And so, using the Charter of the United Nations, some of these African nationalists tried to use this to get the British people to relinquish their power over British West Africa. So this is one of the effects of World War II on British West Africa. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss the key post-World War II nationalists. We have Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. We have Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Sir Milton Magai of Sierra Leone, Dauda Kairaba Jawara of Gambia. We also have Chief Obafemi Awolowo of Nigeria, Sir Ahmadu Bello of Nigeria, and Dr. J.B. Dankwa of Ghana. There were so many other nationalist leaders, but these are some of the key nationalist leaders we have. So we're going to begin with a discussion of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, his key contributions to the nationalist efforts. So Dr. Benjamin Nnamdi Azikiwe, also known as the Zik of Africa, was a journalist, nationalist, Pan-Africanist, and political leader. He was also the first president of Nigeria. He was born in 1904 in Zungeru, northern Nigeria, to Igbo parents. He attended various schools in Nigeria before going to study in the United States of America. So while abroad, he was exposed to Pan-Africanist ideologies, which strongly influenced his nationalist thinking. So he returned to Africa in 1934 and began working in journalism. He was appointed editor of the African Morning Post in Ghana. And when he returned to Nigeria, he founded the West African Pilots in 1937. Now let's move on to the next slide. Right, journalism was Zik's weapon for arousing national consciousness and exposing colonial injustice. It was through the newspaper that he was able to present his thoughts about the colonial government. So in 1944, he co-founded the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons with Herbert Macaulay. After Macaulay's death in 1947, Azikiwe became the leader. So we understand that Nnamdi Azikiwe was part of the Nigerian youth movement, one of the proto-nationalist movements. But afterwards, he left that party, left that movement, and formed the Nigerian Council of Nigeria and Cameroons with Sir Herbert Macaulay. So when Sir Herbert Macaulay died in 1946, he became the leader of the NCNC. So he participated in the 1945 general strike to support the rights of African workers. We talked about how some of these Africans were demanding increased wages, and he helped to support these people so that they too can also support the nationalist movements, the agitation for independence. So he led a delegation to London in 1947 to demand constitutional reforms. So this is after the Richards Constitution of 1946. The nationalist leaders at the time felt that the Richards Constitution was not fully representing the interests of the African people. And so they led a delegation to London in 1947 to ask for a reform of the Constitution. So he advocated for self-government, press freedom, African education, and equal political rights. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, he played a leading role in all the constitutional conferences leading up to independence. So he played a role in the drafting of the Macpherson Constitution and the Littleton Constitution, and also in the Lancaster House Conferences of 1957 and 1958 as they drafted the Independence Constitution. He advocated for federalism and equal representation for all regions. He wanted equal representation for all regions. Before the Second World War, all the regions were not represented equally, especially the northern region. They were still governed by proclamation at the time, while the southern region still had limited electoral power. So all of this was what he advocated against. He wanted equal representation, and he wanted a federal system of government to be adopted within the Nigerian society. So he became premier of the Eastern region between 1954 and 1959. Of course, after this period, the position of premier was abolished as they paved the way for the independence of Nigeria. So after independence, he became the Governor General of Nigeria between 1960 and 1963 under the parliamentary system. So under that parliamentary system, we're still practicing a parliamentary monarchy. Our head of state was still Queen Elizabeth II. But he was the Governor General representing the head of state in Nigeria. So eventually, when the parliamentary monarchy system was scrapped, we became a parliamentary republic. And then he became the ceremonial president of Nigeria between 1963 and 1966. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss Chief Obafemi Awolowo. Chief Obafemi Jeremiah Oyeni Awolowo was a lawyer, a journalist, a nationalist, a philosopher, a political leader, and the premier of Western Nigeria. So he was born in 1909 in Ikenne, Ogun State, which was then Western Nigeria. Remember, it was a province within the Nigerian society at the time. And then he was raised in a Christian Yoruba household. He studied law in the United Kingdom, and while in London, he was influenced by Pan-Africanism and nationalist ideas. So in 1947, he returned to Nigeria and became involved in active politics. So he established the Nigerian Tribune newspaper in 1949, which also became a tool for political education and nationalist agitation. He opposed colonial economic exploitation and such rapid developments in the region. So also he was an advocate of regionalism. He was trying to ensure that each region should be able to take care of itself and develop their region in order to make sure that they can compete nationally. Now let's move on to the next slide. In 1951, he founded the Action Group with strong support from the Yoruba-dominated Western region. So at that time, the political parties that were formed after the Second World War were created along ethnic lines. So the Action Group was a party dominated by the Yorubas of the Western region, just like the NCNC was dominated by the Igbos of the Eastern region. So most of these political parties that were created after the Second World War were created along ethnic lines. Then he became the first premier of the Western region between 1954 and 1959. Of course, this position was scrapped before independence. He also introduced free primary education in the Western region, which was the first initiative of its kind in Africa. He launched free healthcare for children and expanded hospital services. He built roads and introduced rural electrification. He also advocated for federalism, just like Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, as the best system for Nigeria's diverse population. Now let's move on to the next slide. He also advocated for intellectual nationalism, the idea that Africa must reclaim its identity through knowledge and self-confidence. So he was an advocate of intellectual nationalism. He participated in the constitutional conferences in London from 1953 to 1958. So all of the same conferences that Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe participated in, he participated in them as well to contribute to the reform of the political system here in Nigeria. He also became the leader of the opposition in the federal parliament from 1959 to 1966 and pushed for accountability and transparency in government. So after the election, the independence election, he was unable to win any of the major seats, but he became the official opposition to the leaders in power, to the leaders in the parliaments. And so he had an active role in Nigeria just after independence. So we've come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. I believe it was educative and enlightening. If you would like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There we are going to continue discussing the post-World War II nationalists. We are going to discuss Kwame Nkrumah and also other nationalists. And afterwards, we are going to move on to several other topics, several very important topics about nationalism after the Second World War. I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly, tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.